Welcome everybody, both in the auditorium and also those online, and hopefully those people online can hear and see what's going on. So this is our first Director's Choice seminar for this year. Maher Gandhi from MARTA and myself will be chairing this afternoon. I'm really looking forward to the content of today's seminar. So John Prins has recently taken over as the Executive Director of HealthTranslation Queensland. He tells me he's been in the job around about 6 weeks. He's flourishing in his new surroundings. And the reason we thought John would be a really good person for this first seminar is that he's just returned from 4 years heading up the medical school at Melbourne University and has had really quite the opportunity during that time of being in Melbourne to look around and see some of the things that are happening in Melbourne, some of the things that are going well, and maybe even some of the things that aren't going so well. Victoria is often envied by much of the rest of Australia, particularly for their unsurpassed ability to attract funding from a whole range of sources towards medical research. So some of you will know John, you may not all. John, as I said, has just come back to Brisbane after 4 years at Melbourne University, heading up the medical school. He's an active clinician scientist. He's been a thought leader in both diabetes and endocrinologist, highly published, has done very well at attracting research funding over the years. And given his experience both in Queensland and in Victoria, I think he's an ideal person to address this topic around the future of medical research in Australia and the lessons for Queensland from Melbourne. Before we go any further, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting today, the Turrbal and Yagara people. We recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and community. We pay deep respect to them and their cultures and to elders past, present and emerging. So without further ado, I'll pass you over to John, and should be plenty of time for questions and discussion a bit later on. Thanks, John.
Thanks very much, John, for that kind and somewhat exaggerated introduction, but also for the invitation to speak. It's a courageous person that gives me a microphone and an open time slot of 1.5 hours, but we'll see how we go. So I thought I'd just start with a snapshot of what I think is happening right now. It's not just what I think. There's a lot of published work around this. There's a lot of survey work. So this, I think, is relatively factual. And the first thing is that it's without any question that traditional research outputs from this country are extraordinarily high. And it's still almost beggars belief that a country of less than 30 million people could have 7 universities in the global top 100, and that's where we are. And our overall output is also contributed very significantly by strong and well-led medical research institutes, which is a relatively Australian sort of unique situation. But the flip side is if you start measuring different things, other things such as impact or innovation, and this is done formally through the Reuters Innovative University Rankings, where they look at disclosures, patents, spin-out companies, those sorts of metrics. Australia does very badly. And we don't have a single university in the top 200 globally. And we only have 5 in the top 75 in Asia. And let me tell you, they're in the bottom half of that top 75. So we have a lot of room for improvement in some areas, even though we're batting punching well above our weight in others. And then if we turn our attention to health, we've got health outcomes for our population that are the envy of most of the world. We've got very long life expectancy, longer for women than men. I just want to point out there, I'm not quite sure whether we should continue that discussion. But again, there's a disparity here because there are some sections of our population that do not have good health outcomes. There are major gaps. We talk a lot about, for good reasons, the Indigenous gap, but we also have a gap in health outcomes for people with disability, for people who have underlying mental health, for prisoners, for people that don't have English as their first language, et cetera, et cetera. So although our overall performance is very good, there's two sides to the coin. What is also undisputed, I think, is that there is more research money in Australia now than there ever has been. In medical research, we're particularly fortunate because we've got 3 large chunks of money, almost $1 billion each in ARC and HMRC MRFF that we should be actively trying to get our claws into. There's more venture capital money than ever before. There's more non-government organisation or charity money than ever before. So there's a lot of money around. You have to be a little bit thoughtful as to how you apply for it. So in early parts of my career, I applied for and was lucky enough to get quite a lot of money for basic science research, and I used that money to cross-subsidise my clinical research. The latter half of my career, we've got money for clinical research and have used it to cross-subsidise basic science research. So you've got to play the game and you've got to be nimble in your approach. Part of the reason for the need to change approach is that the expectation of funders and indeed of the community has changed. There's much greater emphasis on impact, on outputs, on return on investment. The other observation that's been repeatedly made around the Australian and New Zealand also environment is that the industry-academic relationship is, if you're going to be polite, immature. If you're going to be more accurate, it's poor. And that's a bidirectional problem. Universities and institutes, by and large, don't get industry, and industry doesn't get academia. And there's been a huge amount of effort thrown at this by particularly federal government and to some extent state governments. A lot of work, huge, really good publications from a number of groups, government groups, and EY have published a lot in this area. So we know where the problems lie and we have some mechanisms about how to address it, but they have not been in any way successful as approaches. And one of the reasons for this is that it's internationally recognised that health as a sector is one of the least innovative sectors. And it should be, of course, the most, but it's not. It's a conservative organisation as a worldwide think tank. It doesn't move quickly. It doesn't move with the times. And that, of course, compounds the issues that I'm talking about. And a few more observations are that in this country, and again, it's very well evidenced, research higher degrees are not valued or rewarded in the same way as they are, particularly in Europe and in North America. And so the incentive or the what's at the end of your PhD pipeline is not quite as clear here. And if you go to major manufacturers or the KPMGs or the Ernst & Youngs in London or Düsseldorf or New York, just about everybody walking in that building will have a PhD, whereas that's not the situation here. And so we need to, and it's part of that industry-academia relationship. And because Australia still has the perspective that a PhD is valuable for the content of the PhD rather than the skills that were acquired during that PhD. And internationally, PhDs are seen as a very transferable skill set. It doesn't matter what you did your PhD in, the fact that you've got one tells us that you're a great problem solver. You can distill complicated information sets. You can come up with good ways forward. And it's those skills that you're employing when you employ somebody with a PhD, not the fact that their PhD was in whatever, ingrown toenails or strawberry jam, because it's irrelevant. And it is largely irrelevant. And many of us will have seen that the most effective members of our team have come from other sectors and with other backgrounds. And the workforce has changed across the board, and including that the academic and health workforce. There's less free time. If you're a clinician, you're spending more time on the clinical tools. If you're a researcher, you're spending less time on the research tools. If you're a teacher, because other things, administrative input, other things are encroaching on that time. So the amount of time that our workers have with their nose in some free air to be truly innovative, to be truly thoughtful about things is much reduced. And the response of workers to that situation is that they have less institutional commitment or loyalty than ever before. And rather than complain about the current situation, they will go somewhere else where they think they're going to get a better deal. And this desire for flexibility is strong. It's across all sectors. It's across all age groups. We see it in our students and our staff. And it's something that we need to, I think, be a little bit more accommodating. At the same time, institutions have changed and not necessarily in the right direction, particularly in Australia, which is the most over-bureaucratized country on the planet, probably. We've got greater expectations of compliance, of bureaucracy. Many of us are spending a lot of time doing tasks well below our skill or training level. And this is holding us back. Also, this week, we've got centralisation of services. Last week, we had decentralisation of services. This cycle has been reported by the Latins and the Greeks and probably by the ancient Egyptians. I haven't gone back that far in the literature. And it's because we can't find the middle ground The middle ground, of course, is that magic balance, that sweet spot between having services that understand what's required at the peripheries, but have some of the efficiencies of centralisation. So what we do is the pendulum swings between those two. And it keeps the consulting firms in business. So I guess there's always an upside. And then we have a strong inward focus for CEOs, which has certainly increased in the last decade in my observation. And again, there's some published support for this. The CEO's job should be to look outside. The COO's job should be to run the ship. And yet our CEOs across industries are more and more focusing on internal affairs, looking after the shop. And so advantages of opportunistic things aren't found or sought in the same way. And then we all know about financial pressures, which affect certainly health services and universities alike. The euphemistically regarded efficiency dividend, which many of you will be impacted, which is a very polite way of saying we're going to ask you to do more for less money. And it's really, really problematic. And then waste is rife. And this is a graph that hopefully most of you have seen. It was in the McKeon report, which is an external review of NHMRC. Fantastic report, still very current, very germane. Sadly, a lot of its recommendations have not been taken up by successive governments. But here on the x-axis, you've got the number of dollars at the cost of delivering services, and on the y-axis, the benefit to the community. And here it's measured in quality adjusted life years, but it doesn't matter how you measure it, the curve is exactly the same. And you can see this is where you want to be. The more dollars you spend, you get a really clear impact on the community. And we can see that vaccination screening programs are in that patch. Then you get over here and the curve flattens out. So you're spending more and more dollars for less and less gain. And this area 3 here, low value intervention, is a very tricky area to address. Now, not long ago, I didn't think anybody should have surgery if they're over 70 years old. Now I'm thinking that's actually a pretty good idea. And so you've got ethical considerations here. You've got community consultation here. And these are difficult things. But when you get into these two blocks here, number 4 and 5, that's stuff that we can easily fix. Lost or unnecessary diagnostic text. I can guarantee you that in this hospital, the PA hospital today, there will be tens of thousands of dollars worth of tests ordered that don't need to be ordered for all sorts of reasons. It's nobody's fault. It's just the way the system has grown up. So somebody had an MRI on private land yesterday. You can't get the result. They're urgently unwell. You do another one today. These sorts of things. And you can multiply that by a whole variety of tests, a whole variety of administrative procedures. So there's duplication. We should be able to fix that, and we should be fixing that. And then even worse is this block number 5 here, which is where we're spending more dollars and we're actually causing harm. And obviously that needs to be addressed. And to be fair, federal governments, state governments, HHSs, PHNs are putting a lot of effort into this, and it's a really a primary focus. But if you took a pragmatic approach, if Richard Branson came in and took over, he would say, well, that's 25% of the total spend that we don't need to be spending. Why don't we get rid of all that stuff from this line to the right? And that would mean that every GP could spend 25% more time with each patient, for example, or you might be able to do 25% more operations. Or the government might say, well, we'll continue exactly as we are, but we just save 25%, which we could spend on something else, maybe medical research, maybe tunnels, who knows. But there is money there ready to grab. You can have it pretty quickly. It doesn't require a lot of consultation about how you might achieve it. And it's not negotiable that we have that money available to us. So I've been asked to sort of soothsay a little bit, and again, these aren't all my crazy ideas. There's a huge international sort of think tank around this sort of thing. What's very clear to us in Australia, I think, is that international competitors are improving and adapting at a faster rate than we are, and that gap is going to increase. And particularly thinking China, South Korea, Taiwan, India, these countries, Singapore, these countries really are on the front foot and are leaving us behind. The focus will clearly be, and it already is in business and in industry, on cross-sector activity, collaboration and skills. I think there will be an ongoing emphasis on impact, on return on investment, on outcome measures. So if you think you can just keep on doing what you were doing last century and the world will come back into your way of thinking, I think you're on the wrong track there. Similarly, consumer and community involvement will increase, and that's a good thing. That's not a question. And similarly, industry engagement or pressure for industry engagement will increase. And again, that's a good thing. But not so good things is that there's good evidence that large organisations are undergoing a decrease in their risk appetite when the environment is telling them they should perhaps take an increased risk appetite. There's less and less investment in back of house and in systems, and more expectation that that slack will be picked up by your existing workforce. And there's less and less flexibility. That is problematic across multiple sectors, but as I said before, particularly problematic in health. And this is a worldwide observation. And on that background, our students and our staff are demanding, and they will continue to demand, increased flexibility and increased opportunities for cross-sector exposure, increased opportunity to get a broader experience base and to learn from others. So we need to somehow figure out how we're going to accommodate that. So some considerations for the future then should be, I think, certainly an increase in focus on students and staff and to trust them. We need to reconsider our existing metrics, our outputs, our KPIs, because as my daughters would say, their last season, we're measuring stuff that nobody's interested in anymore. We measure it slavishly because we know how to measure it. And we believe those measures, which is even more concerning because actually not a lot of them are all that good. So for example, I don't think anybody could argue in this room that the aspiration would be for 100% of patients in our hospitals to be involved in some sort of clinical trial or research activity. And in fact, the Director General told me, and he's a smart guy, told me just a couple of weeks ago that that was one of his aspirational goals. But nobody in the state can tell me what proportion of existing hospital inpatients are involved in a clinical trial or research activity. But don't feel too bad, nobody in Victoria can either, and nobody in New South Wales can either. So the one obvious metric that we should be looking at, we're not actually measuring. And there's resistance to take up new metrics because the first thing you'll hear when you discuss a new metric is, oh, it's not necessarily going to be a very good metric. But that's presupposing the metrics we've got now are really good, and that's not the case. So a metric for academic promotion is the number of PhD students that you've supervised, for example. So that presupposes that the more students you've supervised, the better supervisor you are. I think most of us would recognise that that's not necessarily the case. Similarly, if you've had the greatest number of citations, that doesn't necessarily correlate to the greatest impact. So we're using metrics that are flawed, but we understand their flaws. We often don't admit them, but we shouldn't have a reluctance to introduce new metrics that will also be flawed, provided we actually evaluate them and try and introduce them intelligently. We've got to reduce waste. We've talked about that a little bit, but I particularly implore us to reduce low-value healthcare, which comes back to that curve out of the McKeon report, but also reduce low-value teaching and reduce low-value research. And you might say, well, we don't have any way of identifying low-value teaching or low-value research, which comes back to the metrics KPIs argument. But I would argue that if you run a series of 10 lectures and the average attendance rate is 5%, that's probably telling you that that's not a particularly high value teaching experience, or it might be great teaching, but you're teaching something that nobody's interested in. Either way, should you really be doing that? And similarly, you can apply sort of thought process along those lines to your research activities. We have to collaborate and be generous, and you might get sick of me using the word collaborate very soon. And we've got to start to focus on community benefit rather than on the competition, often petty competition. Facilitate cross-sector learning. So rather than somebody leave your organisation to go and get experience in a parallel field, why don't we give them a day a week to go and do that, retain employed. It's always going to be cheaper than a hire rehire situation. And it's going to make a lot of sense, and you'll suddenly have a staff person that's actually got some loyalty to the firm because they've been looked after and they've been allowed to spread their wings and do some new things. And similarly, recognition of prior learning is something that the university sector in Australia is notoriously bad at. Oh, you did 2 years of an undergraduate science degree at the Mayo. Well, we can't give you credit for that because, you know, they don't know what they're doing over there. And you can substitute University College London, Harvard, Stanford. This is crazy. You know, we are all lead organisations. We should be accommodating this transfer of skills and transfer of experience. And we need to develop some institutional pragmatism. That's a great example. Why can't you just accept the fact that somebody's done 2 years at Stanford and just allow them to enter third year at name a university in Australia. No university in Australia will accommodate that right now. So I've been asked to talk about lessons from Melbourne, and as John said, there is a perception backed up by data, and HTQ, Health Translation Queensland, produced a report last year led by Frank Gannon and Celia Webby, which highlighted some of these differences in terms of funding. We are not getting the number of funding, the funding dollars that we should be based on our population. Is that sort of the cut to the chase? But some more sort of personal observations. I should be on the stage. I've got such good timing, you know, dragging my family to Victoria for 4 years, when for 3 of those we were in the most locked down city on the planet, unquote. And just in case you didn't realize, 5 kilograms isn't 5 kilograms is COVID kilogram. 5 kilometers isn't far. And our dog and every other dog in every neighborhood didn't actually adhere to Chairman Dan directives about curfew times and things like that. And so it was a crazy time, and you know, lots of people very seriously suffered, of course. Melbourne's got notoriously fickle weather, so the app that is continually refreshed and most used on everybody's phone is the Bureau's app. They are, as we all know, bonkers about footy. Trams are terrific. Melbourne keeps European hours, and as an early bird, I didn't ever quite come to grips with that. And certainly in our sector, but in many sectors, there's extraordinary depth and breadth and scale of talent, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. But there's also, interestingly, this deep pride in and support of the city and the state. Queenslanders rally 3 times a year at State of Origin, sometimes only 2 times, doesn't matter, you know, depending how the first 2 go. Whereas in, you know, Victorians, there's a much deeper sense of pride and statewide. And it may be because it's a smaller state with a more concentrated population. I don't know what it is, but the difference is palpable. And it's part of this whole thing that I'll be talking about. So as John said, I headed up the medical school there for 4 years. Fantastic time, great opportunity. It's a great school, complicated place. Last year, which is my last year there, the total of the school was 300 million. So it's not a small undertaking. Of that, the competitive research income made up 166 million. So a significant proportion of total revenue. Plus commercial revenue of 37, philanthropic revenue of about 40. So a lot of money changing hands, a lot of money to do activity. Productive in terms of those traditional metrics that I was just sneezing at, 6,300 publications, a lot of them in good quality journals. Quite a lot of patents, quite a lot of increasing commercialization activity. But this is the big thing. The medical school alone, just one school, had 680 research higher degree students enrolled at the end of last year. They came from every corner of society. They were every shape and size. A lot of them were clinicians, not all docs, even though it was a medical school. We had lots of allied health folk. We had really interesting mix. They were embedded in institutes. They were embedded in hospitals. They were in the university itself. So we got this powerhouse of people. And then you've got a huge number of ECRs and a huge number of MCRs. Now that comes with a cost. They were not a happy crowd, especially in COVID time. They are terribly worried about their careers. They're worried about job security. So I'm not for a moment saying that this is a beautiful situation, but the scale and the talent is phenomenal. And then strategically, from the time I arrived, we really put a lot of attention into being competitive for MRFF as a school. And the school's now received over 200 million in MRFF since MRFF's inception. And you know, that was a real game changer. And a lot of those research higher degree students are embedded in MRFF funded projects. And a lot of those projects, those MRFF funding, were a long way from traditional medical school activities. For example, we got 10 million in diabetes commercialization as a national program. We got 3 million to run a clinical entrepreneurship program. So this isn't medical school core activity in a historical sense, but it really added flavour to the school. School ranks well internationally, better than the whole of university, which is always a good way to start your discussions with the Vice-Chancellor. It's a big school, 350 students a year. I campaigned that it should be smaller. I completely lost that fight. I lost plenty of fights, of course. It's very big by international standards. It's the biggest school in the top 20 internationally by far. UQ, as we all know, is even bigger. There are attendant benefits, but also attendant problems with that. And the other thing we did is we introduced a completely new MD curriculum 2 years ago now. We're in the second cohort this year. And the underpinning philosophy was that it needed to be flexible, there needed to be cross-sector opportunities, and there needed to be multiple dual degree options in that. And 20% of the curriculum, a day a week equivalent for the entire 4 years, is completely directed by the student. They can choose things from anywhere in the university, anywhere in the institutes, anywhere in the hospitals. They can invent their own programs and we will improve them. So it's an open box for 20%, 22% of the curriculum impact. And the students have voted with their feet with those changes. We've got a 40% increase in first degree, first preference applications, 5-fold increase in Indigenous applications, lots more mature students. This year we've enrolled with 4 MD Master of Engineering students, dual degree. We've got 20 that are doing a medical degree and a public health degree. We've got 5, I think, doing an MBA, a couple are doing law, dual law medicine degrees. So we made all those opportunities possible and people are grasping them because they know that that differentiation will be important for their careers. They'll have 2 strings to their bow at least. So that's been successful, a lot of work, but great fun. So here's the precinct, Parkville, Melbourne Biomedical Precinct. There's lots of names, usually just referred to as Melbourne, because if you're in this precinct, you assume that that's the only thing there is. It doesn't matter what's beyond that. So this is about 2 kilometres in each direction. And the med school was here. This is the university campus here. And to give you and each one of these numbers, it doesn't matter what they are, is a place of excellence, an institute, whatever, a hospital, university digs. So for example, this is St Vincent's, Eastern Hill over here, St Vincent's Hospital, the Bionics Institute. I did some research in the Bionics Institute. That was a 20-minute walk from my office here. And I was on the Murdoch board, for example, which is up here at the Children's Hospital, and that's a 15-minute walk in the other direction. So you walk everywhere or you hop on a tram. This is Monash Institute for Pharmaceutical Sciences, which is a fantastic drug discovery place that does a lot of collaboration. Again, 15 minutes walk up Royal Parade. So there's a sense of co-location and sort of cross-referencing, which is incredibly important, and it's buzzing as a precinct. So think about that precinct, just some fun facts. Well, as I've already mentioned, there's this population concentration. Victoria's got a bigger population than Queensland and much smaller geographical area, so that's easy. And the government's priorities are different. If you look at Queensland government R&D spending, which I'm sure most of you don't, for good reason, it's roughly 50-50 in primary industry, fishery, agriculture on the one hand, and biomedicine. If you look at Victoria, it's only biomedicine. So there's more money because there's more population. There's less cost because it's a much smaller geographical area. You don't have decentralized populations, and you've really only got one thing to spend money on. So that's a huge advantage. They do a lot of things very well. They also significant room for improvement, as John alluded to. It's not all sweetness and light. In that precinct, the University of Melbourne the precinct is the University of Melbourne. Everything's affiliated with it. RMIT is just down the road, and it's a big player in engineering, in architecture, in and IT, and it collaborates incredibly well with Melbourne, but it's not got a real footprint in biomedicine. So in biomedicine in our area, you've got a single university which is dominant. Similarly, Monash is dominant on the south side. A key component of this precinct are strong, very well-led affiliated institutes that by and large are complementary in their activities to the university. They're also competitive, but they're complementary. Most of those institutes have a flavour, so that's recognised. You've got Floria in neuroscience, you've got Weehai in immunology, you've got Peter Mac in cancer, Murdoch in children's, etc. And they are powerhouses. Murdoch's a quarter of $250 million institute. These are big. Weehai's much, much bigger. So you're talking about institutes with 500 to 1,000 staff that are literally 20 metres from the medical school across the road, and they all collaborate. A key differentiator, which took me a year or so to sort of tumble to, was this extensive senior cross-representation at board levels. So there's a lot of confidences, but there were no secrets. Everybody knew what was going on. So for example, I'm head of the medical school. I was on the MCRI board. I was on the Centre for Eye Research Australia board, which is the 3rd biggest eye researcher on the planet. I was on the Bioincubator Limited board, which is a joint venture between Weehai University and CSL, 2 floors of the new CSL Taj Mahal's bioincubator space. I was on the board establishing that. It's going to open later this year. I was on the Peter Mac Advisory Committee for their Education and Research Committee, The list goes on. The HTQ equivalent in Melbourne University is called MAC, Melbourne Academic Centres for Health. I was on their board for 4 years, chair of their board for a year. And hospital CEOs, institute CEOs, it's at that level that there's cross-representation. So everybody knows everybody else's business in an intimate way, in a confidential way, but it means that you can then collectively plot and scheme, which is an enormous strength. And so wins are sought collectively and they're celebrated collectively. The other differentiator is there is a much stronger academic culture in teaching hospitals, particularly in Melbourne, less so in the more regional areas. For example, I'm a clinician in Royal Melbourne Hospital, diabetes and endocrinology, still am, and every consultant in that unit either had a PhD or was undertaking a PhD, not one exception. That includes the VMOs, that includes everybody you can think of. And all the trainees are already plotting and scheming, what's PhD, who can I do my PhD with? So it's a difference. Now, as John alluded, there's always blood on the floor, a lot of blood on the floor in the Parkville Precinct, but you don't see it from the outside. It's nicely covered up. And that's part of the secret. The precinct is incredibly politically proactive, and that's another area I think that we could learn from in Queensland. So state government, federal government, you fight as a pack. I lost count of the number of meetings where you'd be in a room with the MP, the Minister or the Director General, and you'd have a couple of CEOs of major hospitals, you'd have a couple of CEOs of institutes, you'd have some senior university people, usually have an NGO or two thrown in, all wanting to chip some money in, and you're a united voice. You don't give the government the opportunity to divide and conquer or to wedge. It's a really impressive approach. And similarly, key national bodies, huge representation. It's lobbied for. If Melbourne doesn't have more than its fair share of people on NHMRC senior committees, the Victorian Premier would ring the Minister for Health centrally and say, you better get your NHMRC, boys in line and girls in line because we don't have enough people at the table. But it's that sort of proactive stuff. And during lockdown, a lot of this had to sort of change the way we did it. But every little window in lockdown, whether it was a day or a week, I guarantee you that every MP was being hassled by somebody from the precinct. Usually the MPs were on the precinct. Similarly, the government can move very, very fast there. So if there's an opportunity that you raise with the government, that maybe with industry, and you say, we're going to go, we'd like to put a bit of money on the table. Not only do they say, well, we'll guarantee you some money on the table, but we'll come with you, so that it's a convincing story to industry that government is in bed here, wants to play. So really impressive joint effort for one. The institutes also are in competition with the university, of course, but there's also a nice competitive pressure, particularly around some nimbleness, how long to get a contract going. So the institutes have a huge advantage in terms of being a preferred employer for many people because they're just easier to work with. There's a lot of reasons for that. They're a bit smaller. They don't have teaching to worry about. So in a sense, they're uni-focused and often in a single discipline. But they've got executive capacity that you can't sort of dream about in a large comprehensive university. And they play to that strength. I've mentioned at Hunts in the pack. And we all talk about Melbourne Monash sort of rivalry and lots of stuff, but by daylight, Monash is the strongest collaborator with Melbourne. Doesn't matter what you measure. Grant income, joint supervision of students, publications, nothing else comes close to Monash as a partner for the University of Melbourne. So that's again comes into the strength of the city, strength of the state. And the other observation, which I don't think applies here to the same extent, is that for everybody in the Parkville precinct, they'll die in a ditch for their institution. You're a Murdoch person or you're a Weehai person or a Peter Mac person. But very, very close second is you're a Parkville person or you're a precinct person or you're a Melbourne person. Whereas here, we look after our own institution, and then after that, we don't sort of worry too much. So that collective spirit is, and collective intent is lacking here. So you might all think this is a miserable story and the odds are pretty bad for us to be competitive, but I still think there's plenty of room for optimism, but as many of you will know, I'm an incurable optimist. So some final suggestions, and I'll try and tie it together. If I haven't mentioned it, I think we should collaborate. We've got to create scale. We've got to reduce waste. We've got to harmonise. A lot of the work we've been doing in HTQ over the last couple of years has just demonstrated the in brutal detail how much duplication there is and how much waste there is. We've got to get better at that. Rather than complain about our geography and our demographics, it's like the Brits complain about the things they can't change, the weather, for example, and they don't complain about the things they should change, like the food. We could be taking advantage of our geography and demographics. Why aren't we the world leaders in data sharing across large geographical distances? Why aren't we the world leaders in telehealth? Why aren't we the world leaders in equity considerations? Because these problems we face are not unique to Queensland. They are global problems, and we saw how global they were, for example, in COVID, but we should be leading the world here. We've got the skills, we've got the capability. Similarly, we should be capitalising much more than we do on the statewide, near statewide electronic medical record. We've got a statewide pathology service. We've got relatively few hospital and health services, 16 plus MARTA, so 17 in the state, whereas in Victoria there's over 80. So we've got a better chance of getting them to work in an aligned way here than we do in New South Wales or in Victoria. Similarly, we've got relatively few PHNs, and by and large, their geographical coverage is the same as HHS's. So that's a terrific advantage or a terrific opportunity that I don't think we're taking advantage of. We should be advocating to government with one voice. We're our own worst enemy because government can just play universities off play HHS's off against each other. We've got to be a bit cleverer at making it easier for government to give money away rather than making it hard for them to give money away. We've got to invest in our future workforces and train them for the future workplace. We're still training them for the past workplace. We've got to get better at that. And by workforces, I mean clinicians and scientists and clinician scientists, all of whom have special needs, special requirements, need to be thought of separately. The workforce that's keeping the Director General and every hospital CEO awake at night is not the scientist's workforce or the clinician scientist workforce, it's the pure clinical workforce, it's nurses, it's allied health stocks. That's a different workforce to the one that we might be more focused on in this room by and large, which is scientists and clinician scientists. Reconsideration of governance models, as I said, I think it's an enormous strength there. It's a hidden strength, but I think we could get better at that. And perhaps consideration of alternative research higher degree models. I know there's a bit of thinking about this, but is the so-called British model, where you throw some poor student in the deep end and see if they can swim or not, with some insurmountable problem. The Americans gave up on that model decades ago. You rarely have a PhD like that in the US. In the US, it's a skills training, it's an acquisition of understanding of methods, those sorts of things, which is a formulaic approach. And we say, oh, well, that's all a bit too boring. That's a bit too much like a master's. Maybe that's so, but maybe we need to have a rethink, or at least test it. Let's run them in parallel for a while and see what happens. See what the students vote for. That might be a good indication. So finally, a bit of an advertisement for HealthTranslation Queensland. This is what we're planning to attack over the next few years. The clinical priority area that the board has come up with, and nobody, of course, can argue this, is mental health. So, and then we've got a lot of activity planned and already ongoing in sort of the clinical area agnostic activities, such as clinical trials, consumer and community engagement, ethics and governance. And QTrack is this clinician scientist formal pathway that is being piloted this year at Royal Brisbane with UQ, and we're hoping to be able to roll that out statewide over the next year or two in every healthcare discipline, as it already is in the pilot. And the whole point of all this is to attack the three things that were identified in the work that HTQ has done and the work that many other organisations have done, where we've got to try and attack some problems in the ecosystem or the environment. We've got to make sure people are appropriately trained and skilled, and we've got to try and find some more money to do all of these things. So there's an advocacy role there. So I'll stop there, John, and happy to take questions. Thanks very much.
Thanks, John. That was very illuminating. Do we have any questions in the room, John? Okay, just over there. While we're waiting for the microphone, I'll take Chairman's prerogative and have a question. So are there any lessons for Queensland that Melbourne need to apply?
A single electronic medical record would be an amazing start. The four hospitals, as you walk up Flemington Road in the Parkville precinct, you go Peter Mac, Royal Melbourne, Royal Women's, Royal Children's. They have just created a single electronic medical record across those four. So they are going to blow the rest of the state out of the water in terms of their ability to manage information, where we've already got that. The other thing is that as you walk that 15 minutes up Flemington Road, you've got 4 hospital and health service boards, 4 separate executives, unbelievable waste, craziness. Whereas, you know, if you took the more Queensland approach, there'd probably be 1 health service across those. Would be a juggernaut, but it would be. So yes, there's plenty of lessons that Victoria could learn from Queensland. The good thing is that they don't think to ask. Because there's a superiority complex in there, isn't there?
I know what you mean.
Thanks, John. Very illuminating. Welcome back to Brisbane. It's good to have you back. So one of the challenges for us as scientists is engaging with the clinicians. Can you just comment on, and the feeling is that, you know, Victorian clinicians get a lot more quarantined research time than they do here. Can you comment on that? And do we really have an issue that we have to somehow address?
I can comment to say that that's untrue. As a clinician in Victoria, you have, if anything, probably less free time than you do as a clinician in Queensland. Certainly not, you know, generous lashings of free time to do what you want. There are more clinicians in Victoria that are part-time and supplement their, and so are dual appointments or cross appointments or conjoint in every variation you can possibly think of. So there's a lot more clinicians that do not take the full clinical salary and self-fund, if you like, through whatever means, an academic component of their workplace. But if you're a full-time staff doc in Victoria, you're pretty much under identical terms and conditions as a full-time staff doc in Queensland. I can tell you that from bitter experience from hundreds of clinicians lining up in my office over the years and hundreds wanting to find a better way to get some more time.
So is there more funding for those part-time positions for them to actually engage in research activity?
Yeah, I think so. Well, there's not just an acceptance in the system, but it's just an established thing in the system that you're going to have a lot of these people around. So every clinical department in the teaching hospitals there's always fellows hanging around. There's always PhD students hanging around. There's always students of every discipline hanging around. That's just the way it is. That's been the situation. For decades. When I trained which is a long time ago. Look at my hair. To get a hospital job in Queensland, you basically had to, as an endocrinologist, you basically had to be born. It wasn't a particularly difficult thing to do. You just had to wait around long enough. Whereas even in my time, you couldn't contemplate ever being appointed at a teaching hospital in Victoria unless you had a PhD. So that's 40 years ago. So that's how long this culture has been different. So it's not a number of dollars, but it's an understanding of the opportunity and an accommodation of people with different mechanisms of action, for want of a better word. There's and those part-time clinicians are much more valued in Victoria because they are still regarded, as high quality clinicians, even though they might only spend a day a week on the tools and they can subspecialize a little bit. So it's an environmental thing rather than a funding thing. I don't know if I've explained that well or not.
I don't think there are any questions online, and I can't see anyone just at them. Okay, Norbert.
Thank you, John. In 9 years, Brisbane will be in the spotlight. The biggest show on earth comes to Brisbane. And when you hear the Queensland Parliament talking, it's a lot about transport and mobility and congestion. So how do you think health research can capitalize on and catalyze on that big spotlight? I mean, yeah. Yeah,
it's a great question, and to which I don't have an answer, I don't think. certainly there's lots of opportunities for us to, and it comes back to that cross-sector. I mean, if you come back to my comment, it's not directly answering a question, but that Queensland government spends roughly the same amount on primary care, fisheries, agriculture that it does on health. How much cross talk is there between those two sectors? And if we went to them with the One Health idea, where you have agriculture, nutrition, zoology, parasitology, infection, and health are so intertwined, we might be able to get some money out, make it easy for government to spend a significant amount of money in that, because we're solving both of their problems with one solution. Similarly, there's a lot of interest already in sports science, in exercise physiology, those sorts of things, and we could capitalise in a sense on that. We should be prospectively looking at the positive and negative impacts of health of the whole show, if you like. Changes in population, changes in transport. There will be implications of that on everything, on housing, on health, on education, that many of which would have a health implication. So from a public health perspective, there's an opportunity to observe longitudinally things and measure those, and perhaps learn and advise the next city that hosts this on some ways to do it better. So great question, but obviously a tricky one.
John, there's a question from Lisa Laxo. In recent times, there's been a tightening of opportunities for PhD students in Queensland clinical settings. Do universities in Victoria cover insurances for higher degree students?
Yes. It's one thing we had to fight a little bit for, but certainly in my time there, it was a topic of discussion early on, and our research higher degree students are fully insured for, irrespective of their own background, whether they're clinically qualified or not, they are insured for interaction with patients and to be on a clinical campus. And indeed, during COVID, those folk were still allowed to enter hospital campuses, even though they weren't allowed on, including our own students, weren't allowed on university campuses.
Ranjini.
Hi, Ranjini. Yep.
Can you hear me now? Yeah. Nice to see you, John.
Thanks.
Sorry, I missed your talk, but I did hear your answer to Graham, and I think you've hit the nail on the head totally. The question is really, how can HTQ change the culture so that non-full-time clinicians who are contributing in other ways are actually valued? Because I think it's almost not only not being valued, there's a shame factor to not pulling your weight and working full-time.
Yeah. Thanks, Ranjini. And I'm not sure HTQ can solve the problems, but we are thinking about it. And, when I was embarking on a career as a clinician scientist, quite a few senior clinicians warned me against it, saying, well, of course, you won't be a proper clinician or a proper scientist, so why would you go down that path? And they were exactly the words that were, and I'm sure you've had a similar circumstance. So I think partly scale comes into it, but we've got big hospitals, we've got organisations that are doing the same amount of clinical stuff, more in fact than the Melbourne hospital. So it's not a lack of scale or a lack of activity that we should be able to accommodate. I think it is still an unusual path rather than a more usual path, and so weight of numbers will help that, and that's why we're interested in sort of pipeline at HTQ and things like data analytics, where an important area that's not recognised as a discipline, health data and manipulation. We're looking at maybe some summer scholarships or internships that we could just get some people into the pipeline. Similarly, Q-Track, where we'll get, formally get clinicians of all shapes and sizes formally on a track that will be recognised as leading to this end thing, which is a Ranjini Thomas, or that will be seen as a desirable thing. My sense is, and as you know, I'm optimistic, things can change very quickly. So in Melbourne, we introduced MacTrack, which is Q-Track's introduced. It's in its third year now. We had students coming to our medical school interviews late last year asking how do they get onto MacTrack. So, and we've now only got 27 MacTrackees running around only. That's a big running around, but it's recognised now as a thing, and it's starting to be aspired to. And a Q-Track will be exactly the same quite quickly. And you have one or two of Q-Trackees at any particular hospital then it'll start to transform things. So I think it's numbers. We've got to encourage this as a workforce that we need to think carefully about to look after the existing folk, but also make it a bit easier and more desirable for people to enter it. And I think, and that's one of the reasons that back in Melbourne, we put so much emphasis on, you probably missed it, but we really deliberately and strategically figured out how we could be successful at MRFF. And we invested in that, invested in people to help support applications, to politic, to do all those sorts of things. And we were rewarded in spades with a lot of MRFF money that in turn did exactly what you did, by and large, supported early career researchers, clinician scientists, supported people in the system. So there's money there for it. You've just got to figure out how to somehow tap it. Joe Forbes.
Hi, John. Welcome back.
Thanks.
Certainly, I'm intimately familiar with this model, having gone through the precinct, the university, etc. One notable difference for me was that the clinical departments actually had scientists embedded in their clinical department. So everybody went to the clinical meetings, everybody listened to the nutritionist, the dietitian, the renal nurse, and so on and so forth. And so collectively, the wisdom from everybody came along together. And I feel when I came to Queensland, that was a very notable difference for me.
Yeah, no, and it's a terrific point, Josie. And for example, in the department at Royal Melbourne, there is 2 staff scientists that are paid out of clinical trial revenue, etc. That, and of all of the things that a department might choose to spend its, hard-earned cash on, well, that obviously was top of the pops because that was just accepted that was an important thing to do. And so not only do you accommodate them, but you actually find money for them, and it's more than just an accommodation of these people in the system. They are an integral part of the system. So it's a good point. Really good.
Alison Pettit.
Great talk, John. I'm just wondering, based on the culture that you described, the differences between the clinical research culture in Queensland versus Melbourne, obviously there must have been different drivers for putting MacTrack in place, whereas QTrack has to deal with a completely different culture that they're trying to come into. Are there specific differences that have been considered between the MacTrack model versus what we're going to do at QTrack that might actually set it up better for success?
Yeah, that's a bit more thoughtful than I'd actually come to grips with myself. Ali, thanks for that. Look, MacTrack was a bit of a battle, well, not a battle to set up. We basically had to get people to dip into their pockets. And that was, so the med school was the organizer of it. So all of the hospitals in which I had, school had medical students were asked if they would be prepared to accommodate MacTrackees. They were intimately involved in the selection of those MacTrackees, and they had to financially support those people across their career path. So they had skin in the game, serious skin in the game. And then the university, same as the QTrack pilot here, university contributed some PhD scholarships and things. But it wasn't a fully competitive salary for the MacTrackees. And then you have to accommodate significant differences even within medicine. So we've got a couple of primary practitioners as MacTrackees and a couple of surgeons, and the training pathways for those are very, very different. Now we've got allied health, we've got nurses, and next year there'll be dentists. Again, very different sort of sets of circumstances. So there has to be some flexibility in there. I think the fundamental problems will be the same here, just getting HHSs or individual hospitals to say, yes, we'll find a bit of money for a chosen one. And we're not talking about zillions of dollars here. We're talking about a relatively small amount of money per hospital. One of the bits of negative feedback we got around MacTrack was some hospitals that didn't have a successful MacTrackee complained that they hadn't had a successful MacTrackee. So we had to say, well, go and find your chosen one and make sure they put in a good application next year. We'll see what happens. So that was a good problem to have, that it was seen by the hospitals as something desirable to have, not just seen by the individuals that were aspiring to enter this. So a bit of sort of competition from the hospitals. And I've had on a few occasions heard hospital CEOs saying, "Oh, we've got 2 MacTrackees, one in X and one in one in discipline X, one in discipline Y." when we go to regional centres, it might be much more difficult here, or we don't have a regional MAC trackee in Victoria yet, and its MAC is very, very Parkville. It's only Parkville precinct. That's a consideration that isn't being tackled in Victoria at the moment, but should be. We're aspiring to go right to a whole of Queensland thing from the start, pretty much. So there will be serious considerations in terms of supervising, in terms of access to facilities, may or may not be an added complication to this deal. But I think the fundamental things you got to solve are, where are you going to get the money from? How do you evaluate entry to the program? And more importantly, how do you evaluate when people aren't going very well and struggling, and give them an off ramp? And we had a lot of discussion about somebody's 2 years into their MAC track and they don't like it, which is fine. How can we allow them a graceful exit and, maintain their skills in other, or help them regain some skills in other areas? I haven't answered your question, I know.
Okay, he's got a question up there.
Hey, could you speak a bit to differences in PhD student experiences, things like scholarships that are available and training for non-academic careers, things like that?
I don't think there's a lot of difference. The good things are the same in both Melbourne and here, and the bad things are the same. There is greater opportunity for people with research higher degrees to find employment, because there's a bigger biotech sector, in terms of our field of PhDs. There's a bigger pharmaceutical company presence. There's other smaller universities that are very keen sometimes to take people on for teaching and other roles. So there's more opportunities just by dint of the population concentration and the greater amount of allied industry in Melbourne compared to here. But, we're not far away here, and we've got Sanofi coming and other things. The opportunities are expanding very, very rapidly, I think, here. So I don't think it's a stark difference.
Okay, I think we might be out of time, and I can't see any other hands up. I think the number of questions and the quality of the questions really spoke to just how many people are interested in your talk, and I gather there are an enormous amount of people online as well. John unfortunately had to leave us a few moments early, but from him and myself, all of you, if we can please just thank John in the usual way. Thank you.